55 million people just lost power. 265 power plants, 8 states, 2 countries, gone in 3 minutes. Inside the control room that was supposed to prevent this, every screen said everything was fine. The screens had been lying for almost 2 hours. August 14th, 2003, a Thursday, Cleveland, Ohio, pushing 90 degrees, air conditioners running across 8 states and the Canadian province of Ontario. The grid was working hard, but not unusually hard, not even a peak demand day. The North American power grid is one of the largest machines ever built. The eastern portion alone, the Eastern Interconnection, serves 280 million people across a web of transmission lines, power plants, and substations that must stay in perfect balance every second, every day. Flip a light switch in New York, a generator in Ohio spins slightly faster. A factory in Michigan starts its motors, power plants across the region compensate. Everything is connected, everything affects everything else. First Energy Corporation, headquartered in Akron, operated the transmission grid for northeastern Ohio, Cleveland, Akron, Toledo. Their control room was staffed around the clock. Operators watched screens showing the status of every line, every generator, every substation. If anything went wrong, an alarm system, part of a computerized energy management system, would alert them instantly. Things started going wrong just after noon. Nobody in that control room would know for almost 2 hours. First, Energy's reliability coordinator was the Midwest Independent Transmission System Operator, MISO, based in Indiana. MISO monitored the broader regional grid and ran computer simulations to predict problems before they happened. Just after noon, MISO's state estimator, a critical modeling tool, was shut down after producing strange results. An operator fixed the underlying data problem but forgot to restart the tool itself. For the next 4 hours, MISO was flying blind. They couldn't run simulations, they couldn't predict vulnerabilities, they couldn't warn anyone. At 1:31 in the afternoon, East Lake Unit 5, a 680 megawatt coal plant on the shore of Lake Erie, tripped offline. An operator had tried to boost its output, but the protection system shut it down. This happens. Power plants trip every day, other plants pick up the slack. The system adjusts. But East Lake's shutdown left a gap in northeastern Ohio, and First Energy was already importing heavy amounts of power from neighboring regions just to keep up with demand. On hot summer days, millions of air conditioners switch on across the grid. Window units, central air, industrial cooling systems. They all do the same thing, spin a motor. And electric motors do something strange to power. A toaster converts electricity straight into heat. What goes in gets used. Simple, but a motor needs something extra. To spin, it creates a magnetic field, and that magnetic field requires energy that isn't consumed. It's borrowed, stored inside the coil for a fraction of a second, then pushed back onto the grid, then borrowed again, then returned, 120 times per second. This back and forth energy is called reactive power. It doesn't do useful work or light your house, but without it the grid's voltage collapses. Think of it like breathing. Real power is the oxygen your body uses. Reactive power is the air you inhale and exhale. You need the full breath even though you only keep a fraction. Stop breathing deeply enough and you suffocate, even if there's plenty of oxygen in the room. On August 14th, every air conditioner in 8 states was breathing. And here's the problem. Reactive power doesn't travel. Transmission lines themselves consume it. The farther you try to ship it, the more the lines eat. First, Energy needed reactive power locally in Cleveland, in Akron, right where the demand was. They had equipment for this. Capacitor banks, devices that generate reactive power on the spot, the grid's local oxygen supply. At least 4 were offline, routine maintenance during one of the highest demand periods of the summer, so they pushed their generators harder, squeezed everything they could out of the East Lake coal plant on Lake Erie, and then East Lake tripped. Protection systems shut it down. Now the Cleveland-Akron area had almost no local reactive power. Voltages were dropping. The system was importing massive amounts of power over long transmission lines that were themselves consuming the reactive power the region desperately needed. The grid wasn't broken, not yet, but it had no margin left, and the operators had no idea. 2:14 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, something happened inside First Energy's computer system. The operators didn't know it. The screens in front of them looked the same as they had 5 minutes ago. The control room was quiet. Nothing beeped. Nothing flashed. But the alarm system had just stopped working. At 2:32, American Electric Power, a neighboring utility called First Energy, a shared transmission line had briefly tripped and reconnected. Something was going wrong in northern Ohio. First Energy's operators checked their screens. No record of the event. They dismissed the call. For the next half hour, the control room in Akron looked perfectly normal. Operators doing their jobs, watching their screens, drinking coffee. Beneath them, the grid was bleeding. 3:05 p.m., the Chamberlain-Harding line, a 345 kilovolt transmission line south of Cleveland. It sags into a tree and trips. No alarm. 3:32 p.m., the Hannah Juniper line, overloaded by the power that the Chamberlain-Harding line was supposed to carry. It heats up, sags, hits a tree, gone. No alarm. 3:41 p.m., the Star South Canton line, now carrying the load of every line that's already failed. It sags into a tree, gone. No alarm. With each failure, the remaining lines absorbed more power. They heated up. They sagged towards the trees below them. Power flooded into the lower voltage, 138 kilovolt system. Lines never designed to carry that kind of load. 15 of those lines failed in rapid succession, and in the control room, the screens were still frozen, still showing a grid that no longer existed. I was wondering what's going on there. We have no clue. Our computer's giving us fits too. We don't even know the status of some of the stuff around us. That was Jerry Snicky, a technician at First Energy, speaking into a recorded phone line minutes before the largest blackout in North American history. He was telling the truth. He had no clue. At 3:42, nearly 90 minutes after the alarm system failed, First Energy's control room finally told their IT staff that something was wrong. By then, at least 16 transmission lines had gone down. The grid was collapsing around them, and they were still blind. By 4 o'clock, northeastern Ohio was hanging on to the rest of the grid by a thread. At 4:05:57, the Sami Star 345 kilovolt line, one of the last major connections between Ohio and Pennsylvania, tripped. This was the moment. If First Energy had cut power to Cleveland right then, deliberately blacked out their own customers, they could have stopped the cascade from spreading. A painful local sacrifice to save the rest of the grid. They didn't. They couldn't. They still didn't fully understand what was happening. At 4:06, another line failed. The cascade became unstoppable. 4:09, Cleveland's voltage drops to zero. Jim Major, commissioner of Cleveland Public Power, watches it happen. It was like a heart attack. It went straight down from 300 megawatts to zero. 4:10:37. Multiple lines between Michigan and Ontario trip within seconds. 4:10:38. Michigan separates from Ohio. 4:10:38. The power flow reverses across the Ontario border. 4:10:39. Western Pennsylvania separates from New York. A 3,500 megawatt power surge slams toward Ontario. 4:10:46. New York's power grid splits apart. 8 million people in the city go dark. Rick Gonzalez, chief operating officer at the New York grid operator, would later recall, in literally a matter of 5 or 6 seconds, the lights flickered and went out. 411, the Fitzpatrick nuclear reactor in Oswego in New York, automatic shutdown. 412, Bruce Nuclear in Ontario, Jenna near Rochester, 9 Mile Point, all shut down automatically. 413, the cascade is over. In 3 minutes, 265 power plants shut down. 508 generating units went offline, including 22 nuclear plants. 55 million people are without power. It is the largest blackout in North American history. Across the eastern United States and Ontario, the world stopped. In New York, subway passengers were evacuated through darkened tunnels on foot. Thousands walked home across the bridges, a scene eerily reminiscent of September 11th, just 2 years earlier. Times Square went dark, traffic lights died, cell towers ran out of battery power, ATMs stopped working. In Toronto, Ontario Premier Ernie Eves declared a state of emergency. The Sky Dome kept its roof open for a week to conserve power. Outside Detroit, the Enrico Fermi nuclear plant shut itself down. Gas stations couldn't pump fuel. Water systems lost pressure. Hospitals ran on generators. For most people, the blackout was an inconvenience, a strange night, block parties and stargazing in Manhattan, but not for everyone. 11 people died in the immediate aftermath. A man in Harper Woods, Michigan, a suburb of Detroit, ran a generator inside his house and died of carbon monoxide poisoning. A young burn victim in North York died when his air conditioning failed. His skin grafts from a 2001 accident needed constant cooling. A cyclist hit by a car in Guelph, Ontario. A father of 2 struck by a car in his front yard west of Ottawa. Years later, researchers published a study in the journal Epidemiology analyzing mortality data from New York City during the blackout. They found that deaths didn't just spike from accidents. People died from respiratory failure, heart attacks, heat exposure, the invisible consequences of a city without power on a 90-degree day. Their estimate, approximately 90 excess deaths in New York City alone. 90 people gone. Because of what? In the hours after the blackout, everyone had a theory. New York Governor George Pataki blamed Canada. Canadian officials blamed Ohio. Even President Bush addressed the nation that evening, assuring Americans this was not a terrorist attack. Bill Richardson, the governor of New Mexico, a former U.S. Energy Secretary, went on live television and said what a lot of people were thinking. We are a superpower with a third world electrical grid. U.S. Energy Secretary Spencer Abraham and Canadian Natural Resources Minister Herb Dhaliwal assembled a joint investigation. The U.S.-Canada Power System Outage Task Force. Dozens of engineers, investigators, and analysts from both countries began a forensic reconstruction of every minute of August 14th, sifting through thousands of circuit breaker operations, power plant logs, voltage recordings, and phone transcripts. They knew the cascade had originated in Ohio. They knew First Energy's transmission lines had failed one by one over 2 hours. They knew other utilities had called First Energy to warn them. But the central question remained: why hadn't the operators responded? The answer would take months to find, and when they found it, it was buried in millions of lines of computer code. First Energy used an energy management system called the XA/21, built by General Electric Energy, a Unix-based system written in C and C++. More than 100 utilities around the world ran versions of the same software. The XA/21 monitored everything on First Energy's grid and alerted operators the instant something went wrong. On August 14th, it stopped alerting them. For weeks after the blackout, nobody could explain why. A team from GE Energy began an intensive code audit. They worked for 8 weeks, recreated First Energy's entire system in a laboratory in Florida, fed it the data from August 14th, tried to make it crash. They couldn't. The system ran fine. They had to slow it down artificially, injecting deliberate delays into the code before they could trigger the failure. And then they found it. The bug was called a race condition. Inside the XA/21, two separate software processes sometimes needed to access the same piece of data. Normally, they took turns. A lock in the code ensured that only one could read or write at a time, but there was an error. Under a very specific combination of alarm conditions that had never occurred in the entire history of the software, both processes could acquire write access to the same data structure at exactly the same moment. The data got corrupted, and here's what made it so devastating. The alarm system didn't crash. It didn't display an error. It didn't go dark. It simply stopped updating. The screens in the control room still showed data. They still showed the status of every line, every generator, every substation, but it was old data, frozen data. The operators were watching a picture of a grid that no longer existed. The window of opportunity for this bug was measured in milliseconds. It had lived inside the software for years, across hundreds of installations worldwide. It had never been triggered, not once. Ralph DeNicola, First Energy spokesman. It had never evidenced itself until that day. This fault was so deeply embedded, it took them weeks of poring through millions of lines of code and data to find it. A timing error, two processes colliding for a fraction of a second, in millions of lines of code that had run without incident for years. That is what silenced the alarms. That is what blinded Jerry Snicky and every other operator in that control room. That is what turned a manageable afternoon in Ohio into the largest blackout in North American history. The task force released its final report in April 2004, 238 pages, 46 recommendations, 4 direct causes. First, Energy failed to understand how vulnerable their own system was. First, Energy failed to keep trees trimmed away from transmission lines. First, Energy failed to manage the reactive power their grid needed. And most critically, first, Energy had no situational awareness because their alarm system was dead and they didn't know it. Energy Secretary Abraham announced that the Department of Energy would not punish First Energy. The reason was simple. Compliance with reliability standards was voluntary. There were no enforceable rules, no penalties for failure. The grid that served 280 million people ran on the honor system. Congress passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005. For the first time, reliability standards became mandatory and legally enforceable. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission could now impose fines of up to $1 million per day. 96 new standards were adopted. First, Energy replaced its computer systems, upgraded its monitoring, improved its tree trimming. The XA/21 bug was patched. It has been more than 20 years since August 14th, 2003. The grid is different now. Better sensors, faster communication, mandatory standards, phaser measurement units that didn't exist in 2003 now track the grid's health in real time. But the fundamental architecture hasn't changed. The Eastern Interconnection is still one giant machine. Generation and demand must balance every second. Everything still affects everything else. In February 2021, a winter storm collapsed the Texas power grid. More than 4.5 million homes lost power for days. At least 246 people died. Researchers at Carnegie Mellon University studied decades of blackout data. They found that large blackouts, those affecting more than 50,000 people, still occur about 12 times a year, the same rate as 1984. Their models suggest a 2003 level event will happen roughly once every 25 years. We're overdue. More renewables, more electric vehicles, more demand, more extreme weather, and the same interconnected grid. Jim Major watched Cleveland's power drop from 300 megawatts to 0 in seconds. He said it was like a heart attack. Rick Gonzalez watched New York City flicker out in 5 or 6 seconds. Jerry Snicky told the truth into a recorded phone line. We have no clue. The operators at First Energy weren't incompetent. They were experienced professionals doing their jobs. They sat at their stations. They watched their screens. They followed their training. Their screens were lying to them. A software bug, a race condition, 2 processes fighting over the same piece of data for a fraction of a second. That's what blinded them. That's what killed the lights. 55 million people lost power on August 14th, 2003. Most of them will never know why. If you like this documentary, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more.